educate and prepare the children for the community. And then in the Brown decision in 1954, they talked about the importance of educating students to be citizens in our democracy. And so really this rise of thinking about just trying to educate my child at the relative expense of others potentially is very new. And I think certainly does make it harder to try to achieve some of the goals of the integration movement.
Professor, is there a good way to define how segregated our schools are today in 2019? What's the best way to kind of quantify that?
Sure. I am the author of a recent report that looked at school segregation 65 years after the Brown decision, which was in 1954. And that was a decision, of course, that said that segregated schools were inherently unequal and really launched the current efforts for desegregation. We looked at a couple of different measures. One, the percentage of Black and Latino students in 90 to 100% non-white schools, and there is a growing percentage of students in such schools. It's also important to think about the segregation of white students. White students are also harmed by segregation, and there has been a decline in the percentage of white students in extremely white schools, but white students still have the lowest exposure to students of other races in their schools than students of any other racial group. And so this is really, to me, shows that we have growing trends of segregation and concerning difference in terms of the kinds of schools that students of different races are going to.
Dennis Parker, what's your sense of why schools are still so segregated? The Supreme Court demanded that integration be enacted through Brown versus Board of Education. Separate is inherently unequal. Are there one or two big factors, Dennis, as you see it, that have prevented integration from happening?
I think there are two things that really have prevented integration from happening. Number one is that we live in a country that is still very segregated in housing, and because school zones are determined by housing, that has an impact. But I think the second thing is that there is still enormous resistance to integrating schools, that there is still pushback. And, you talk about this being 65 years since the Brown decision was handed down, and there was a full 16 or 17 years where there was massive resistance in the South to any desegregation efforts. The sad truth is that there is also resistance in the North. And if you look now, the states that are the most segregated are the states that we think of as being liberal states. New York has the most segregation for Black students, California for Latinx students. So I think that there's still resistance to desegregation. One of the things to remember is that millions of school children are bused every day. The only complaints, the only contentious things are when you're talking about busing for the purpose of desegregation. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that we have not advanced as far as we should have after that declaration by the Supreme Court 65 years ago.
So, Dennis, should we just kind of bottom line this? And I don't want to be too categorical, so correct me if I'm wrong, but should we just bottom line this and say that school integration has not happened because we still have a lot of prejudiced white parents who don't want their kids, or even flat out racist white parents who don't want their kids going to school with Black and brown children? Is it that simple?
I think that is a factor, yes. And I think, again, part of the reason that I say that is that it's not limited to areas that we think of as being racist, that very often, even in progressive areas, the Upper West Side of Manhattan, Brooklyn Heights, there still is a resistance of many parents to send their children to school with Black and brown students. So all of these things are continuing to be a factor. The fact that we're talking about busing now, to me, seems like a diversion. What we should be talking about is the question of segregation and the question of discrimination and the current and the continuing legacy that those things have. Busing was just a tool to try to break down the system of white supremacy which the Supreme Court identified in 1954. They didn't use those words, but they said that segregation was an indication that Black students were regarded as being lower in the hierarchy. And they said that the damage that did was so profound that it would affect students for the rest of their lives. They talked about a stigma that was unlikely to be undone. And in spite of the fact that we were talking about children who were being harmed on a continuing basis, there really wasn't meaningful progress to desegregation for more than a decade, well more than a decade. And there's still, as Erica said, there are still problems in this country of segregation and disparity of resources and educational opportunities.
And I do want to get to some of those other factors as we continue our conversation. But Professor Frankenberg, I don't want us to get too much farther without just being clear and defining that term. Give us a good, clear definition of what busing is and how busing works.
I think Dennis is right that busing to some extent is a political construction that we've used to talk about what is really resistance to going to desegregated schools. Busing is a tool that was used prior to Brown, in fact, to maintain segregation in the district that in Topeka, Kansas, where the Brown decision came from. Linda Brown was being bused past a white school to a black school. In many districts across the South, the one I grew up in fact, the same thing. A black student was being bused 17 miles to a black school. So busing is not inherently something that is about desegregation. It's a tool that school districts use all the time. My 3-year-old would love to ride a school bus right now, but she's too young. So I think that we have to realize that we have constructed it to be something to try to get white resistance to efforts to try to create desegregated schools. And what we need to focus on is how do we create desegregated schools, and keeping busing as one of those tools that we use.
And Professor, that term got kind of politically charged fairly quickly, right?
Absolutely. So certainly President Nixon was someone who talked a lot about forced busing in ways that connotated, government overreach, and was something that his administration was certainly against. And then there was the 1971 Swan decision from the Supreme Court from Charlotte Mecklenburg that talked about, it's known colloquially as the busing decision, but of course it really just talked about how you had segregated neighborhoods, and the school district couldn't then rely on a pattern of neighborhood schools, because that would result in segregated schools, that they had to combine neighborhoods and, if necessary, use busing to take kids to a different neighborhood for integration.
Yeah, Dennis, I'd love you to break down the Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg case when we continue our conversation with Penn State professor Erica Frankenberg and Dennis Parker, Executive Director at the National Center for Law and Economic Justice. We welcome more of your questions and thoughts as well, 1a@wamu.org. I'm Joshua Johnson, and you're listening to 1A from WAMU and NPR.
Mornings are already pretty difficult, right? I mean, you're showering, you're dressing, you're getting ready, you're probably making breakfast. Everything you have to do to actually start your day takes time that you probably don't have. Well, that is where Up First comes in. It's the morning news podcast from NPR with everything you need to know. What happened yesterday, what's happening now, what's happening later, and why it matters to you, all in about 10 minutes. Up First from NPR. You can find it on NPR One or wherever you get your podcasts.
From Portland to Beijing, NPR keeps you informed at home and abroad. NPR, always on.
The road to the 2020 election starts with SiriusXM Politics.
Keep America great.
From the debates.
If I'm elected president, everybody will count.
To your reactions.
That's the type of forward-leaning thinking that people want to hear about.
Hear from all sides on SiriusXM Patriot, Progress, and POTUS.
Seeing a woman center stage was so refreshing.
A restoration of American values. That is what Donald Trump has delivered.
The road to the 2020 election.
This is just getting started.
SiriusXM Politics. Channels 124 to 128.
Your voice will be heard.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from C3.ai.
C3.ai's software enables organizations to use artificial intelligence at enterprise scale, solving previously unsolvable business problems. Learn more at C3.ai. From Noom, offering a personalized weight loss program that uses psychology and small goals to change habits, with the goal of losing weight and keeping it off for good. Learn more at Noom, Noom.com. And from the Annie E. Casey Foundation.
This is 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson. We're talking about busing in the United States and the larger efforts to desegregate America's public schools with Dennis Parker, the executive director at the National Center for Law and Economic Justice, and Penn State professor Erica Frankenberg, who's the director of the university's Center for Education and Civil Rights. We'd love to hear from you too, especially if you have stories to share about busing as a parent, as a teacher, as a student. Comment on our Facebook page, tweet us at 1A, or email 1A@wamu.org. Dennis, I should also ask you, Professor Frankenberg mentioned some of the experiences that she had in terms of school integration efforts. What about you? Were there any kinds of integration efforts, Dennis, like busing or anything else while you were in grade school?
Well, not really formally. My elementary school, and I went to public schools for the first part of my educational career, happened to be in a neighborhood that was changing, and changing rapidly. It had been an all-white neighborhood, and then, frankly, shortly after my family and a couple of others moved in, quickly became an all-black neighborhood. But the time I was in school was actually integrated because it was right in the middle of that change, in that 10-year period when there was, at least for a while, integration. I did receive a scholarship to go to a private school that was actually 20 miles away, to which I took a train. I was the only black student in the class, so I would classify that as a segregated white school. And the school was excellent. It had great resources, but it was limited because of the fact that it was segregated. It is now a much more diverse school, and it is a better school because it is now diverse. The fact is, the students who were there in the time I was there did not get a full education because it was essentially a single race school, because they didn't learn from having people different from them. And I would argue that the white students suffered as much as I did, and the black students who didn't get a chance to go there. So that's really my experience.
Arthur wrote in our inbox, I experienced firsthand forced government busing as a student in the Portland public schools in the late 60s and early 70s. It did not go well. Even with forced busing, the schools remained segregated within, i.e. classes were not integrated. The students bussed in took remedial classes and not college prep classes. African Americans and white students self-segregated themselves in the cafeteria. It was a turbulent time with lots of tension, not conducive to a learning environment. Professor Frankenberg, I'd love you to react to Arthur's comment, particularly because part of the discussion after the whole Kamala Harris-Joe Biden tete-a-tete was about voluntary busing versus mandatory busing.
Sure, and really the busing that Joe Biden was against was busing to mandatorily reassign students, which is unlikely to be the case these days. I think the comment, though, is a really important one to help us understand again that busing isn't a magic wand that's going to solve our problems. Busing, again, is a tool to help get people of different races in the school together. But that in of itself doesn't bring you the benefits that both Dennis and I have mentioned. You need to make sure that the classrooms are integrated, that you have a diverse faculty and staff that reflect the student body, that you are not tracking in ways that resegregate by race. And so it provides a necessary precondition to realize the benefits of integration, but you have to change the entire structure, and that's what integration was about. Too often there was so much fighting over desegregation that schools like the one that Arthur talked about didn't reach that full integration and realize the benefits that are so important for equal status integration to happen. And I think some of the later episodes in terms of districts that quite frankly, delayed longer, could learn from some of the mistakes of the earlier generation. And so some of the voluntary efforts, for example, magnet schools, think about both how to attract students from different races, but also how to make sure that they're having equal experiences, that everyone has the same opportunities for college prep classes or electives, things like that, that are really important to the school experience.
Dennis, we mentioned the court case Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg. Tell us what that case was about and what came out of it.
The case was really important because it was, in essence, the Supreme Court saying enough, that it's time to actually do something. There had been a series of cases that were in the Supreme Court, in the federal courts in general, that resulted because of the resistance to the Brown decision. And the resistance was huge. In Virginia, a number of counties actually got rid of public schools and instead had publicly funded private schools. In other places, the students were greeted with hostility. School districts would claim that the schools were all open, but the parents of black students who tried to integrate schools would lose their jobs or be harassed. School buses in some places were actually burned. There was enormous resistance. Some school districts had one a year plan where the kindergarten would be desegregated and then the next year second grade, in essence saying we're going to take 13 years to do this. The range of ways that schools, that counties and school districts resisted the Supreme Court mandate to respect the constitutional right of black students was breathtaking. And the court had to keep striking down in a growing number of cases, practices that continue to harm black students. And what happened in Swan was they said, as I said, enough, that enough time has passed, that now you are going to be required to do whatever is necessary to desegregate the schools. And they talked about how you could use the whole range of options, rezoning, where you build schools, all of those factors, and if necessary, busing, because they recognized that the problem of segregation was a deeply entrenched one, and that unless school districts were instructed to desegregate the schools, they would continue the resistance that they had practiced for, by that time, almost 2 decades. And I have to say that looking at my knowledge of the law, there are very few, if any, things like times I can think of where the Supreme Court said there was a constitutional right to something, and that much time passed before that right was guaranteed, even at the most basic level. So the Supreme Court was saying, now is the time to do something.
And briefly, Dennis, before we move on, what's the legacy of Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg today? Does that decision still stand?
It does. Well, as Erica said, these cases were cases that were brought to address de jure segregation, states where they had laws that required separation. So there's a constitutional violation. Swan deals with what school districts have to do to remedy constitutional violations. There are still hundreds of old school desegregation cases that are still on dockets in courts across the country. But the rules of Swan only apply to a finding of intentional discrimination by a school district or by a state. But they do still apply to those schools.
Let's get to a voicemail from one of our listeners. Elise in Myrtle Beach shared this note with us after she left a Kamala Harris campaign event.
I will say I live in South Carolina, and I was further inland than the beach when I was growing up. And I'm about 5 years younger than Senator Harris. I had a very important experience where my mother and I guess my teacher saw something in me, and they said, there's a better school for the 6th grade that you can attend than your local school, the one for which I was assigned in my black community. And I went ahead, I went across town. I was the only person from my community who did that, and it was a good, pivotal learning experience for me.
Elise, thank you for sharing your story with us. And, I noted, Professor, that she called her experience pivotal. Senator Harris noted that she achieved and excelled in life because of the early educational opportunities she got. Both Elise and Senator Harris were little black girls at the time. So, Professor, how did black students benefit from busing, benefit from the integration efforts that have already taken place?
Sure. We have a robust body of social science literature that shows a range of different benefits for Black students in particular, who have been the most studied, that they achieved higher educational attainment, graduate from high school, were more likely to go on to college, have higher occupational aspirations, and that some of these were even perpetuating benefits so that they accrue to the second or even third generation. So I think the way that both she and Kamala and many people I saw on social media after that debate talked about that was me, and that experience was really pivotal. I think is certainly borne out in what we see in the research. But I think it's also important to say that there are many of us who were white children who were part of desegregation too. I was part of a desegregation in my district growing up, and that certainly has fueled my interest in studying this today. And I think we need to not overlook the fact that white students have a range of social and psychological benefits from integrated schools too, that we don't see talked about as often, but is really important and goes back to some of the things that Dennis talked about in his own experience of going to a white segregated private school, that we all need to be preparing students for living in the diverse country and world that we're in, and that's a really pivotal time in elementary school, for example, when some of these ideas are still being shaped. And so the extent to which we can think about public schools, which are our most public institution, 90% of kids go to public schools, as a really important way to think about how to expose students across racial lines.
Dennis, I'd love you to respond to Sacco, who tweeted, "What about the notion that integration removed black students from being taught by black educators? If racism is structural, how could this play into removing black students from safe environments to then be put in a class with majority white peers and teachers?" Dennis?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. You don't have to be in an all-black school to be taught by a black teacher. And I think one of the things that the school desegregation cases say is that you don't want to have schools that are identified as being white schools or black schools. Now, that's not to say that any school district has enough representation in the teaching staff. Certainly not as much as they should have. It's important for white students also to see teachers of a whole range of our races and ethnicities. And this is another example, and it's going back to what you had read earlier about the hostility that people faced in many cases when they were part of desegregation programs. I think it's unfair to blame that experience on integration or on busing when the problem is the underlying racism. The problem is the inability of people to accept people who are different from themselves. And to think that by ending desegregation efforts that you're going to address that problem, I think is mistaken. And I think that as long as you think that the solution is to end busing, then you are focusing on a symptom and not focusing on the cause, which is that underlying segregation and the discrimination that still persists.
That kind of dovetails, Professor, into a voicemail we got from Andy in Louisville. He left us this note about his thoughts and experience.
I was a product of forced busing in the 70s and 80s. It was the worst thing. I know it was done for integration within the city of Louisville, and it was supposed to be a marvelous thing. Hear other people have had great experiences with it. Maybe they weren't forced to go someplace where you weren't wanted, and kids weren't forced to come into neighborhoods where they weren't necessarily wanted either. We had riots and all kinds of stuff the first year that this went on. I was not for forced busing at all.
Andy, thank you for sharing your story with us. Professor, it sounds like some of what he dealt with just had to do with the discomfort and the fear and, as he said, the violence that came along with merging these two groups of students. Is that just inherent to the process, or are there ways to make busing in particular less dramatic, less discomforting for the communities that are involved?
I think when I hear Andy's comments, I really think about the lack of constructive leadership that was certainly evident in that era. And Louisville is a really interesting story that I'll come back to in a minute. But to me, there was so much effort by local school districts to resist school desegregation, to submit plans that they knew wouldn't work or would cause the most chaos and disruption, so that then you could say, look, school desegregation or busing doesn't work, and then be done with it. And so to me, when I think back to really the experiences that people across the South in particular experience, and the North is a little bit of a different story. I think I look back and I wish our educational leaders, our community leaders, our politicians wouldn't have seen resisting school desegregation as the political opportunity that they did, and instead would have thought about, these are children, they only go through school once. How can we make sure, even if we don't agree with this, that we're structuring the schools so that they're as welcoming as possible, particularly for children who are coming from a different neighborhood or are leaving the school and community they once knew. And that's where principals and teachers are really important, other adults in the school, and also providing training. Now, Louisville is an example of a place that first bused across district boundary lines even to maintain segregation in the early 1970s. They then consolidated it into a countywide school district. There was violence initially when they put together a pretty complicated busing plan in the mid-1970s. But today, they're a district that is voluntarily busing children across the school district for integration, because they believe that in the importance of the gains that the children in the community have gotten from integrated schools. And once they ended court oversight for desegregation in 2000, in the last 19 years, they have employed a number of different voluntary integration cases to integrate schools across the county, and is really one of the largest examples of a voluntary integration plan that's still going on today.
We actually heard from some of our listeners in Kentucky, including Rebecca, who tweeted, "I was in public schools in Jefferson County, Kentucky. I remember violent anti-busing demonstrations. Our family supported busing. When we drove past angry protesters with 'honk if you're against busing' signs, my dad refused to honk, and I was sure we would be attacked for it. Terrifying." Kevin wrote, "I was in elementary school in Louisville, Kentucky during the 1970s, and I was terrified of busing. My family's fear was passed on to me. As a white kid, I was convinced that if I was sent to a black school, it would be a free-for-all. I have not thought about this since childhood, but the current discussion about busing has brought it to mind. What a warped view for a child to have." We will continue in just a moment with Professor Erica Frankenberg and Dennis Parker of the National Center for Law and Economic Justice. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the other factors affecting the quality of schools. We've heard from a number of our listeners about charter schools and school vouchers and how those factor into this larger idea of integration or what might be standing in the way. And I'd love to get your sense of what needs to be done now to finally, after 65 years, make good on the promise of Brown versus Board of Education, if we can. Stay close. The Me Too movement has helped millions of women share their stories of sexual assault and harassment. But imagine having so many stories that you could make a list. That is what happened to authors E. Jean Carroll and Chavisa Woods, one of whom has Donald Trump on her list. Me Too and the struggle to make the first incident the last. Next hour on 1A.
For the curious mind, the world contains a lot of mysteries. Why do we love surprise endings in movies? How do zip codes determine our destiny? Can religions evolve in the same way species do? I'm Shankar Vedantam, and on Hidden Brain from NPR, we reveal the unconscious patterns that drive our behavior using science and storytelling. Find Hidden Brain on NPR One or wherever you get your podcasts.
I am strong.
Has your community faced hardship?
I am healthy.
Are you looking for hope and inspiration?
I am blessed.
Joel and Victoria Osteen would love to come to your hometown to host a SiriusXM Town Hall and meet with you and your neighbors.
My children are mighty in the land.
Be a shining light of hope in your community.
I am victorious.
For official rules and details, go to SiriusXM.com/Joel Osteen Radio by August 1st. No additional purchase necessary.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from PBS with Chasing the Moon. American Experience brings the space age to television in a new 3-part series, a story of science, politics, and spectacle. Chasing the Moon continues tonight at 9, 8 Central on PBS. And from Babbel, an interactive language program that teaches travel, business, and casual conversation skills in a new language like Polish. Available in the App Store or online at Babbel, BABBEL.com.
A quick word about tomorrow's program before we dive back in. We will continue our series Foresight 2020, interviewing the Democrats running for president. Next on our list is Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State. He's made climate change the centerpiece of his campaign, and he said he will fight for women's reproductive rights. Send us your questions for Governor Inslee by voicemail, 855-236-1A1A, or you can leave us a radio-quality audio file with our app, 1A Vox Pop. You can hear all of our candidate interviews online at the1a.org. Just click on the Series tab and select Foresight 2020, and we will share some of your questions for Governor Jay Inslee tomorrow on 1A. Also, just in the last few minutes, we've learned a bit of sad news for one of America's most historic independent presidential candidates. According to the Perot Group, H. Ross Perot has died at the age of 89. He was a self-made billionaire from the state of Texas, born in the small town of Texarkana, educated at the Naval Academy, and became one of the very first people to become super rich in the computer industry after founding a company called Electronic Data Systems. He ran for president twice as an independent, got 19% of the popular vote in 1992, none of the electoral votes, got less of the vote in 1996 when he ran. His death comes after a battle with leukemia. His statement from his company says, quote, "With deep sadness, I'm letting you know that Mr. Perot passed away early Tuesday at his home surrounded by his family. Mr. Perot was a true patriot and a dedicated humanitarian. He will be missed greatly, but his legacy will live on all over Texas, including in Dallas, where the Museum of Nature and Science bears his name." H. Ross Perot died this morning. He lived to be 89. Back now to our conversation with Dennis Parker and Professor Erica Frankenberg. Dennis, you talked a little bit about how Northerners responded to busing. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? What was going on in the North that was different from what was happening in the South?
Well, the big difference between the North and the South is that the northern districts didn't have the same law that required segregation, but still did things which resulted in segregated schools. So it was harder to prove that there was intent to discriminate. But there were northern cases. I was involved in one in Denver. I and Dr. Frankenberg have been working on one in the Hartford metropolitan area for 30 years, or at least I've been working for almost 30 years. And there were cases certainly in Boston. I happened to be going to school in Boston right when school desegregation was going on. And I have to tell you, in a career of doing school desegregation cases in the South, I never encountered any general hostility and racism as severe as what I saw in Boston in the 70s in the South. And so that gives you an idea of how hard the resistance was. In my own county of Westchester, Yonkers had both a housing and a school desegregation case that was made necessary because of constant actions which were put in place to cause segregation in both housing and schools.
Now, Dennis, I hate to cut you off, but I know that you are blowing the minds of some of our more progressive listeners who are thinking that a place as urbane and cosmopolitan and worldly wise as New York or Boston or Los Angeles, these centers of thought and art and intellectual rigor should surely be more enlightened on things like school integration. And what you're saying is they're not, that it's a problem for everyone everywhere. And if you think that you're better because you're in the North, you're kidding yourself.
It's as depressing as hell.
Yeah. Does that make it harder in the North to do something about it because of that mentality that, oh, we couldn't possibly be doing that?
It makes it harder because in some cases people will describe themselves as being progressive, and so how could I be discriminatory? And there's so many forms that discrimination takes. It can be the intentional, burning a bus in the South, or it could be implicit and unconscious bias that teaches you that students are more dangerous if they're black or brown. Much of my litigation, in addition to the school desegregation cases, has been litigation that looks at disparate punishment. And what we see is that black and brown students are disproportionately punished, are punished for things that white students aren't punished for, are given more severe punishment. And that happens in school districts all across the country. There's still an underlying problem. As you read the accounts of people who talked about how horrible things were when they were in these schools that were desegregating, you have to remember that this is a country that had to fight its greatest war to decide the question of whether or not you can sell human beings. And the price that was paid and the number of lives that were lost didn't take care of the underlying problems. So that it's a little naive to think that things would go really smoothly in light of that history. And it's an indication that this is something that we have to work on, and all of us have to work on, whether you live in the Upper West Side of Manhattan or in Alabama. You have to think about your decisions. People who move into gentrifying neighborhoods but won't send their kids to schools where there are mostly black and brown students need to take a step back and think, why do I feel that?
Professor Frankenberg, what about anything you would add about that North-South divide, or what it takes to kind of break through with school integration in the North versus the South? Anything you would add to that?
Just a couple of points I would make. One is, I think, in our discussion over what are the tools to accomplish desegregation, which again was obviously a very necessary one given the massive resistance in the South in particular, we moved away from talking about why this matters. And so we moved away from talking about the importance of desegregated schools for all students. We didn't talk about the ways in which white supremacy or the legacies of segregation, enslavement, we're still perpetuating decades later, and the need to take overt actions. And so I think it's unfortunate that in talking about the tools, we lost some of the talking about the framing, which of course is important in the South, but also important in places like the North, who can say, well, at least I didn't send my child, we didn't have black schools or something like that. And it wasn't overt, but they were still making moves in terms of using school choice or what kind of neighborhood they were moving to. There's so many fragmentation of school districts in the Northeast, for example, that create almost one race school districts. And so by moving, you're able to, in essence, move away from desegregation if you have the means to do so. And if you're white, you're not subject to the same kinds of housing discrimination. And so I think that there were really important ways in which this de facto segregation that manifested itself made it easy for Northerners to think that they weren't as bad as Southerners, when in fact, Southern schools by the early 1970s were much more desegregated than in the Northeast, a trend that is still true today.
Professor Frankenberg, can I jump in right there in terms of school choice? We got some questions about that, and I'd like to get your perspective on that. Let me read two quick comments. Harry writes, a significant factor in perpetuation of school segregation in Michigan is the promotion of charter schools at the expense of public schools. The major architect of this tectonic shift was Betsy DeVos, referring to the Secretary of Education. And Nancy asked, do we see legislators doing similar things to prevent integration today with creating vouchers and charter schools paid for by taxpayers? Professor?
So certainly in a unequal and segregated society, which we still have today despite glacially slow progress in residential integration, we're going to have choices that are going to be unequal unless we take steps to try to constrain choices in ways that might provide more integration. So when we have a decentralized system like vouchers or charter schools, that may unintentionally aid those who have the resources to know about schools, to make the school choice. In some places, charter schools and vouchers don't provide transportation, so of course, not all families are equally able to take advantage of that. And so I think it's really important to look very critically at the use of government funds for both charter schools and vouchers, and to think about the way in which that may be incentivizing segregation. There's also in Michigan, you can open enroll across school district boundary lines. Again, that's only available to families who have the means to do that and know about that legislation. And so there are a range of ways in which school choice, which certainly is a growing part of the discussion and has been supported by Republican and Democratic politicians alike, has been designed in ways that have not taken account of what we need to do in order to design it to be more equitable and provide access to all.
As we're winding down, Dennis, let me get a quick response to one more comment. Nancy emailed, I've never understood why all property taxes don't go into a single pool in any district to benefit all schools equally. Using homeowner taxes only in the area where the homes are perpetuates the basic inequality that results from lesser quality education when schools are deprived of funds. Dennis, a number of our listeners asked economic questions, just funding questions about school integration. Is there any way around integration being expensive, costing money? You know, you can have methods to move kids around and put teachers in different places, but the bottom line is that this is not going to come cheap.
Quality education, including integration, is not cheap. That's one of the most important things that the state does, is to educate children, and it costs money to do that. Sadly, the Supreme Court rejected a case in Texas, which looked at the role of funding formula in terms of giving different resources to different schools, and found that there wasn't a federal cause of action. There have been a number of cases in state courts that have required some sort of equity funding. But the fact is that good education costs. And I think it's important to recognize, some people will say, well, should we spend money on education or should we spend it on desegregation? And I would argue that those are not two different things, that they are connected, that a high quality of education is one that includes desegregation as one of its goals.
One more comment from a listener. Osmond tweeted, I'm not sure about the 70s, but we currently have the same in Lee County, Florida. Lee County is southwestern Florida. That's where Fort Myers is. My son spends almost an hour one way to and from school. It's painful for me and the kids. I prefer a system where education is brought to the people, not the other way around. As we're winding down, I asked you earlier to really kind of define what we mean by segregation. I wonder, Professor, what would integration look like? How would we know if we had actually succeeded?
Sure. I think that integration is where we have schools that are racially diverse, and there is racially diverse students as well as faculty.
Now, define diverse. I'm sorry to cut you short, but define diverse. Are you talking about a
Sure.
direct one-to-one proportion with the U.S. population, or what does that mean?
I think it's unrealistic, for example, for a student living in California to come to central Pennsylvania for school in order to make schools perfectly reflect our public school enrollment, which today are a majority non-white. I think about it on a regional basis. Let's think about our region. We do a lot of other governmental services on region. How do we make our schools roughly reflective of the region we live in? How do we make sure that we have adults from all different races and ethnicities so that both white students and students of color are seeing role models across races? How do we make sure that the classrooms reflect the school enrollment, make sure that things like discipline are not disproportionately for students of color, that AP courses aren't disproportionately for white students. And so those are some of the things that I think that we would start to think about if we were truly getting integration to work. And I think that would then help our communities.
Dennis, when I was in high school, I did an experiment. The white kids used to sit on the north side of the cafeteria, and the black kids sat on the south side of the cafeteria. I went to Suncoast Community High School in Riviera Beach, Florida, which is one of the top high schools in the country. Big magnet school, very culturally diverse at that time. So I did an experiment. Instead of orienting the tables so that they were kind of perpendicular to the building, I turned them so they were parallel. So they were these long stretches of huge, long tables, just to see what it did to people. They sat in the exact same places on those tables. They adapted to the pattern. How do you break that pattern inside the school? Even if you have kids from different places who come together, that doesn't mean that they have to like each other or work together. How do you change that?
Well, there are a few things. Number one, you could never break the pattern if you have wholly segregated schools. Then there isn't even the opportunity to do that. But the other thing is that you need to look at all aspects of an educational experience. I bet if you looked at the football team that you saw people of different races interacting with each other, or girls soccer, or any of the other sports. If the school is running well, the other activities should reflect that diversity. If I could answer and add on to what Erica said, I would consider successful desegregation as a program where, as used to happen in the cases that I did, not only in the South but in the North, where you couldn't identify the honors class by the race of the kids who were sitting in the seats, where the people who were on the dance team or the cheerleader squad reflected the full diversity of the schools. Once you have that, once you have schools where everyone has their needs met and where every activity reflects the potential and the identity of all the students, that's successful desegregation.
And before we go, Professor, is there one thing that you would like everyday people to do, parents, teachers, school supporters, alumni, to improve integration in our schools before we go?
Sure. I think as white people as well as people of color, we need to think about how our lives are reinforcing segregation and how we can make changes to produce more integration and push our legislatures and our politicians to do more, not just to try to divide us.
Erica Frankenberg is a professor of education and the director at the Center for Education and Civil Rights at Penn State University. Professor, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you so much.
And Dennis Parker is the executive director of the National Center for Law and Economic Justice. Dennis, thanks very much.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you also for sharing your stories with us. We'd love you to keep sharing them. Let us know what aspects of this huge issue you'd like us to tackle next. Also, do send us your questions for Governor Jay Inslee, 855-236-1A1A, or use our app, 1A Vox Pop. This conversation was produced by Morgan Givens. To learn more about him and the rest of our team, visit the1a.org/staff. This program comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thank you so much for listening. This is 1A.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Visiting Angels, professional caregivers assisting adults at home in bathing, dressing, meals, and light housework nationwide. Visiting Angels, America's choice in senior home care. Learn more at 1-800-365-4189. And from Babbel, a European-made language learning program. Babbel teaches practical conversation in Italian, Russian, Swedish, and other languages. Available in the App Store or online at babbel.com.
Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State is among the Democrats running for president. He says the environment is not a single issue and that he's not a single issue candidate, but
I want to be able to look my grandkids in the eye and say I did everything I could to prevent the climate crisis from degrading their lives.
Your questions for Governor Jay Inslee next time on 1A.
I'm Jeremy Hobson. We'll continue our series on how China's influence in Asia is affecting U.S. influence there with a look at Pakistan, where the U.S. cut military aid and China quickly stepped in.
Pakistani political insiders will tell us that, look, the U.S. wasn't offering us what we needed anymore, and China was knocking on our doors, so we're gladly taking their help.
That's next time on Here and Now.
Today at 12 noon East, 9 West on NPR Now.
I'm Maria Hinojosa, host of Latino USA. NPR gives voice to all Americans, from the well-known to people in the shadows, people who live all around you but you may not know. Public radio journalists take you to places you may not go to on your own. Because to be engaged citizens, we have to know and want to understand the world around us. This is NPR.
Being sexually assaulted once is one time too many. But imagine going through it so much that you could make a list. A long one. From WAMU and NPR in Washington, this is 1A. Hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. Today on 1A, Enduring Assault. Two authors are writing about their all-too-frequent experiences and the toll it took on them. One woman turned her experiences into a memoir she clearly wishes she never had to write. The other claims that Donald Trump assaulted her decades before becoming president. We'll speak to them and to a national leader of the Time's Up initiative about the toll that constant harassment can take. If you can relate to their stories, we'd love to hear from you. Email 1a@wamu.org or tweet us at 1a.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. Billionaire and former presidential candidate H. Ross Perot has died in Texas, according to a family spokesman. He was 89. Perot twice ran for president, famously jumping into the 1992 campaign as an independent. He challenged incumbent President George H.W. Bush and Democratic challenger Bill Clinton. Perot founded computer services giant Electronic Data Systems Corp. And later Perot Systems. A day after the first Democratic candidate withdrew from the 2020 presidential race, another is hopping in. NPR's Scott Detrow has more.
The field is back to 24 candidates. On Monday, California Congressman Eric Swalwell ended his campaign. A day later, another Bay Area man is entering the campaign, billionaire Tom Steyer. Steyer has been a Democratic activist and donor for years. He initially focused on environmental causes, but more recently has spent millions of dollars on a campaign to impeach President Trump. Steyer had previously said he would not run for president in order to focus on his impeachment push. Now he's changing his mind. But he's entering the race at a time when polling numbers and fundraising are separating the candidates into a pack polling at 1 or 0%, and 5 candidates drawing broader support. Scott Detrow, NPR News, Washington.
State lawmakers in Virginia are holding a special legislative session today to consider new gun laws. NPR's Brackton Booker reports this comes more than a month after a mass shooting in Virginia Beach where 12 people were killed.
The session was called on by Democratic Governor Ralph Northam just days after a city employee opened fire, killing a dozen of his coworkers in Virginia Beach. The governor says what he wants from lawmakers is votes and laws, not thoughts and prayers. It's not clear if any of the proposals the governor is calling for will be adopted. That's because Republicans hold control of both chambers of Virginia's General Assembly.
NPR's Brackton Booker. The Justice Department is asking federal judges to approve a complete change in the legal team defending the Trump administration's efforts to put a citizenship question on the 2020 census. NPR's Hansi Lo Wong reports.
The move would switch out every single career Justice Department attorney who had been defending efforts to add the question, is this person a citizen of the United States? Former DOJ attorney Sam Oliver-Friedland says changing the legal team at this point is highly unusual.
I suspect that it is a move of a Department of Justice that is serving a client that is asking them to do something that they are finding very difficult to do within the bounds of ethics and within the bounds of the law.
Attorney General William Barr says the administration has found a, quote, pathway to adding the citizenship question after the Supreme Court ruled last month to keep it off for now. Any new census changes could derail preparations for the constitutionally mandated headcount. Hansi Lo Wong, NPR News, New York.
On Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrials are down 102 points at 26,697. It's NPR. The 90th Major League Baseball All-Star Game goes under the lights in Cleveland tonight. From member station WCPN IdeaStream, David C. Barnett reports both the American and National League rosters feature a lot of young talent.
24-year-old Cleveland pitcher Shane Bieber admits he's a bit starstruck, but he'll refrain from asking for tips from some of the veterans he's rubbing shoulders with.
I'm not going to try to pick anybody's brain too much or annoy anybody, because I know we're all trying to enjoy, being here and have a good time and really just trying to soak it all in.
Bieber is part of a youth movement in this year's game. 19 players are 25 years of age or younger, making it one of the youngest rosters in All-Star history. And Cleveland is breaking an All-Star record of its own tonight. This is the 6th time the city has hosted the Midsummer Classic. For NPR News, I'm David C. Barnett in Cleveland.
The chairman of the House Judiciary Committee says his committee will vote Thursday to issue subpoenas for testimony and documents from a dozen current and former officials of the Trump administration. Democrats are seeking to question them about the administration's immigration policies and the detention of families. A federal appeals panel says President Trump cannot block critics from his Twitter account. A 3-judge panel of the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals says that the president violates the First Amendment when he blocks people who criticize his policies. The court ruled that a public official using a social media account for, quote, all manner of official purposes cannot exclude people from an open online dialogue when there's disagreement. I'm Corva Coleman, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from iDrive, maker of Remote PC, providing real-time access to PCs, Macs, and servers from anywhere for use when telecommuting or for remote management. Learn more at remotepc.com/NPR. And the Annie E. Casey Foundation.
Mornings are difficult enough. Taking a shower, getting dressed, making breakfast, everything you have to do to actually start your day takes time that you probably don't have. That's where Up First comes in. It's the morning news podcast from NPR with everything you need to know. What happened yesterday, what's happening now, what's happening later, and why it matters to you. All in about 10 minutes. Up First from NPR. You can find it on NPR One or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson in Washington. The Me Too movement has centered around individual men accused of assaulting or harassing multiple women. But what happens when one woman deals with multiple harassers? Elle Magazine columnist E. Jean Carroll can relate to this. 2 weeks ago, she published an article in New York Magazine listing several of the men who took advantage of her. Her list includes 2 big names: former TV executive Les Moonves and Donald Trump. More than 20 women have accused President Trump of sexual misconduct, including Ms. Carroll. The president has denied these accusations. What happens after women share their stories? And what happens when the incidents are so numerous that you could almost lose count? As you might expect, this conversation will probably get very intense, especially if you are a survivor of rape or assault. So if you'd like to listen to this later, when you're ready, you'll find it online at the1a.org. Also, if you or someone you know needs help, you can reach out to the National Sexual Assault Hotline. Here's the number: 800-656-4673. Again, 800-656-4673. Joining us from NPR in New York is E. Jean Carroll, advice columnist for Elle Magazine and author of What Do We Need Men For? A Modest Proposal. E. Jean, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Joshua. It's delightful to be here.
Also joining us from NPR in New York is Chavisa Woods, the author of 100 Times, a memoir of sexism. Chavisa, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
E. Jean, let me start with you and give you a chance to tell your story for those of you who didn't read the piece in New York Magazine. Before we get to the piece involving now President Trump, reading the piece was really hard and heartbreaking and infuriating. And I think that was kind of the point, is to show the grinding impact of kind of a lifetime of men just being disgusting and what that does to a person.
Yes, Joshua, you nailed it. It has been, yes, I have run into 21 hideous men. However, my life has been very happy and almost a very merry life. I have not let any of these 21 men get to me. I have kept my chin up. I put it behind me as fast as I can. And I'm finding, Joshua, in the book, you'll see, it's a humorous take on most of the hideous men because, Joshua, if I thought seriously for 30 seconds about all the horrible things, I would be very sad. And when I'm sad, it doubles my burden, right? But when I laugh, Joshua, as women have done for centuries, we laugh at things that are painful. But if I laugh, I feel better about it. I put it behind me and I move on.
Can I ask you specifically about the incident with Mr. Trump? You said that it happened in a dressing room at a department store, Bergdorf Goodman. Did you know Donald Trump before this incident?
I had met him briefly, and this was in the mid-'90s, and I want to correct everyone's memories. In the mid-'90s, Donald Trump was hailed in New York. We all adored him. He'd walk around the city. He'd be walking around. He was good looking. He would talk to people. He was not totally full of himself. He'd ask you how you were doing. And so I had a little TV show on at the time called Ask Eugene. So I was going out of Bergdorf's. Donald Trump was going in. He held up his hand and he said, "Hey, you're that advice lady." And I'm like, oh, he recognized me. I said, "You're that real estate mogul." He said, "Come advise me. I'm buying a present for a girl." Well, I thought it was the most charming thing I just thought, this is just, I can dine out on this story for weeks. It's just going to be terrific. I used to be a writer at Saturday Night Live, so I'm already forming the sketch in my head. So we look at the handbags. He's not interested in the handbags. We go to the hats. He grabs a fur hat. I say, no woman wants to wear a dead animal on her head. Later, I looked on the internet, and of course, there's a picture of Ivana and Marla Maples meeting in Aspen on the ski slope, both wearing huge fur hats on their head. Anyway, that's so. He, at that point, said, lingerie, and like a fool, Joshua, I thought it was an even better idea because it was going to make a better story. We went up to the lingerie department, and there was nobody there. It was in the evening, and he grabbed up a lilac bodysuit, which was on the counter, and snatched it up and said, "Go put this on." I said, "You put it on." He said, "No." He held it up against me. He said, "It looks like it fits you." I said, "It's your color. It matches your eyes." I was laughing. I thought this was very funny. He said, he made a motion towards the dressing room. I thought, this is even better because I'm going to make him put this on over his pants. That was what I was thinking.
And I just want to be clear at this point, Eugene, it sounds like at this point it was very playful, and you didn't feel at all threatened by him thus far.
This is Donald Trump, well known by every single person in the city. If there's one guy I trust, it's Donald Trump. He is like tall, big, handsome, and here I'm going to use a word that we don't associate with him, but jolly. I know, and I admit it was flirtatious. And, but, you know, when there's a law passed that a woman can't flirt with a man, I mean, why would I leave the house? So
you go into the dressing room.
Well, I preceded him into the dressing room with the idea of making him put this on over his pants. And as soon as he slammed the door behind us and banged me up against the wall, and my head hit, and the fight started. I was so surprised. I was so shocked. He put his lips against mine. I couldn't believe it. My reaction was to start laughing and to try to make a joke about it. And he was dead serious. And that's when it started.
At what point were you able to get away from him?
Very quickly. I'm going to say less than 2 minutes. because what was going on was it hurt. I fought like a tigress, and it was against my will. And I got out, I'm going to guess, within 2 or 3 minutes, and left the store. So it was very violent. And my reaction to it, apparently, my friend told me later, because I had called her on the phone, was to laugh. I apparently continued to laugh until I got out, and I was still laughing when I called my friend. She had to say, "Eugene," when I started to say, "He pulled out this is hilarious, guess who I ran into?" Apparently, she's had to tell me this later. She said, "Eugene, this is not funny. You stop laughing." At that point, I realized I was laughing. So that was my way of dealing with it. And apparently it was my way of dealing with it ever after, because I put it behind me.
We're speaking to E. Jean Carroll, an advice columnist for Elle, author of What Do We Need Men For? A Modest Proposal, and Chavisa Woods, author of 100 Times, a memoir of sexism. Before we get to Chavisa's story, I'd like to play a clip of the president, who has vehemently denied these allegations in Ms. Carroll's story. Here's part of what the president said.
It's a totally false accusation. I have absolutely no idea who she is. There's some picture where we're shaking hands. It looks like at some kind of event. I have my coat on. I have my wife standing next to me. And I didn't know her husband, but he was a newscaster. But I have no idea who she is.
That was President Trump responding to the allegations that he assaulted Ms. Carroll. He also said in an interview with The Hill magazine that Ms. Carroll is, quote, "not my type," unquote. Eugene, what did you make of the president's comments?
I didn't listen to him. And by the way, Chavisa, who's sitting opposite me, put the president on mute when you played that. People do not have a good reaction to him denying the 23rd woman who came forward.
Now, he said he didn't know her husband. Were you married at the time?
No, I was divorced, but he knew my husband because he was an anchorman on TV in New York.
Okay. What made you decide to finally tell your story?
Because I write an advice column, and ever since the Harvey Weinstein bombshell hit, Megan Twohey and Jody Cantner just completely exploded it. Well, the letters I started receiving at the column, women started asking me, should I report my boss? Should I call the police when my husband beats my dog? And I'm thinking, I am so full of malarkey, because I have never told these women really what's going on in my life, and I'm advising them to report things to the police, and of course I didn't do it myself. So I thought it was time. I just couldn't go on being, I guess I was, because it had happened to me, and I'm advising them, I thought I should come clean.
Before we have to pause, anything else, Eugene, that you wish you had done in retrospect?
Can't replay the past, Joshua. That is a fool's game.
Well, but you said you should have gone to the police. Is there anything else you should have done?
No, I didn't. At the time, I couldn't have gone to the police. Any woman who has been through this and is told she has to go report it somewhere, it is almost an this is why women don't report. The feeling of going into a station where once again you're put through, this is an old story, put through the questioning, and why did you do this, and why did you do that? Mm-hmm. And it turns out when I did come forward, a lot of people told me that how wrong I was, why I was wrong to go in the dressing room, I was wrong to talk to him, I was wrong to not report it, I was wrong not to report it earlier, I was wrong to report it too late.
Right.
So it was all my fault, which, by the way, I believe it was my fault. Never go in a dressing room.
Well, we got a number of stories that are similar to yours. We got to pause for just a minute. We'll continue with E. Jean Carroll and Chavisa Woods in a second. I'm Joshua Johnson. You're listening to 1A.
Mornings can be tricky for time management. You got to get up, get ready, get out the door on your schedule. Up First, the podcast from NPR News, helps you get informed on your schedule. Just takes about 10 minutes. You find out the news you need to know today when you want to listen. Up First, the morning news podcast from NPR. Find it on NPR One or wherever you get your podcasts.
From New York to New Delhi, NPR keeps you informed at home and around the world. NPR, radio that goes everywhere.
Madonna.
Let's Madam X together.
Shares her iconic songs. And the stories behind them.
I made a video and it made some people mad.
On a new Sirius XM channel.
There's always a man involved. I'm probably telling you too much.
Madonna's Madam X Radio.
Every time I do a project, I have to take it on like 1,000%.
On now for a limited time on Spotlight Channel 4.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from C3.ai. C3.ai's software enables organizations to use artificial intelligence at enterprise scale, solving previously unsolvable business problems. Learn more at C3.ai. And from Caring Transitions, a senior move resource to help families ease the stress of life's transitions, offering relocation, home cleanouts, and the resale of everyday household items. Locations at caringtransitions.com.
This is 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson. We're speaking about the toll that sexual harassment and assault can take, especially when it happens repeatedly, with E. Jean Carroll, advice columnist for Elle magazine and author of What Do We Need Men For? A Modest Proposal, and Chavisa Woods, author of 100 Times, a memoir of sexism. We'd love to hear from you, especially if you've had to deal with just the frequency of being sexually assaulted or sexually harassed and what that did to you and how you've dealt with it. Comment on our Facebook page, tweet us at 1A, email 1A@WAMU.org. And we understand there may be some details of your story that you need to leave out. That's perfectly fine. Share as much as you feel comfortable sharing. 1A@WAMU.org. Before we get to some of the stories that you left in our inbox, E. Jean, just to close the loop on your story, I can imagine that a number of supporters of the president hear your story and say, see, just another attempt for the liberals to tear him down, and they always do it on the same grounds. There was the Access Hollywood tape. There's all these women who've come out of the woodwork. Now there's the Jeffrey Epstein thing, this billionaire who's accused of sex trafficking. You keep trying to tear down President Trump in the exact same way, and it's not going to work. What would you say to them?
I would say, what? You haven't read about his finances? You haven't read about all the revelations in the New York Times about how he actually had no money in 1995, no money, zero, and he talked the Forbes into listing him at $3.5 billion. This is almost everything. He's been documented by most journalists across the board of telling, since he took office, 10,000 lies. So his supporters don't hear these stories. They are not hearing these stories because they live in their own worlds, just as liberals live in their own world. Well, yeah. And I'm sitting across from Chavisa. Let me tell you, I love her book. She has, the chapter headings are numbers, Joshua, which is laying it out, and it's called 100 times. Yeah. And I love it.
And I do want to talk about that book in just 1 second, but first I should acknowledge that a lot of you left stories for us about what you have dealt with. Some of them are really heartbreaking and were really hard to hear, but we think that they're worth sharing. Let's get to a quick mashup of some of the stories you left in our inbox.
I'd like to share a story about when I was raped in college. I was 18 years old, and for months I'd been telling my boyfriend that I was not ready to have sex. Then one night, I had too much to drink, and he raped me. It's taken me years to come to terms with the fact that I was indeed raped. For most of my young adult life, I blamed myself for drinking too much, but the reality is he took advantage of me, and he took what he wanted.
My name is Susie. I was date raped when I was 15 years old. I am now 67 and still have trouble talking about it without crying. It has impacted me my entire life. It takes power away when you're a young woman. It takes a lot of power away.
My name is Dia. I was assaulted
from the age of 5 to 7 by my dentist, my military dentist in the Philippines. And I have never dealt with it ever. I get more and more traumatized every time I hear stuff going on in the news. The Me Too movement, I couldn't get out of bed for 3 days. And it's just hard. People don't understand. You know, some people are able to deal with it. Some people are just not. That's all. And you just keep going. That's all. You just keep going.
Thank you, Brett and Susie and Tia, for sharing your stories with us. We know it was extremely hard to do. We welcome more of your stories and thoughts, 1a@wamu.org. Chavisa Woods, you've been very patient. Let me come to you and talk to you about your book, 100 Times. What made you decide to write that book?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Me Too movement, and I think it's just brought an issue that's so important to so many women to the forefront. But I was watching it and I was seeing that most of it centered around sexual assault and naming prominent famous men. And that's why the news was really paying attention, and the media was sort of, taking this, and it was a snowball effect, and it, got really big. But I started thinking, the men in my life who have assaulted me and who have discriminated, it's also about discrimination, harassment, and attempted rape and rape, are not prominent famous men with a lot of power. They're just everyday, middle class, working class, normal men, and they still have a disparate level of power in society compared to women. And it's still, even when you're just talking about someone like the lighting tech who tried to rape me when I was 14, hard to get them out of their positions of really minor power. So I wanted to really move it away from just naming and persecuting famous men and start to focus it on what the cumulative impact is on women when this happens to us over and over again, when we face discrimination, sexual assault, and harassment in every sphere of society constantly throughout our lives.
What about the book's title, 100 Times? Any significance to that particular number?
Yeah, I think 100 is a significant number in the collective consciousness. For me, I think that represents something that is profound. We talk about history in terms of centuries. 100 times to me is my attempt to illustrate that this has had a profound impact on my life, that it happened at least 100 times. I'm only 37 years old. So I wanted that to be very clear, but also 100 times I think is manageable to hold, so that the reader can hold the entire story in their mind when they're done reading the book.
Now, as I understand it, Chavisa, you really hesitated to write this book. This was not a memoir you wanted to pen.
No, I'm a fiction author, actually. This is my 4th book and first book of nonfiction, and probably my last book of nonfiction. It's really an activist endeavor. Usually I'm very stylized, part of literary arts. This book is very bare bones. It's just what happened from the age of 5 to 37, literally in every sphere of society, around the world, in different settings, in rural areas, in cities. I hesitated to write it for years. I started writing it 10 years ago and stopped. And when the Me Too movement happened, I thought, you know what, now is the time. I'm ready to write this book, and I'm going to do it.
Were there any patterns, Chavisa, in the men whose actions you document in this list, either in what they did or how they approached you or who they were?
As far as who they were, no. I have found that men of all races, classes, nationalities, religions, social backgrounds have been socialized to participate in sexist behavior from the time they are young, because from the time we are very young, we are taught that women are a subcategory of human, that we are a very different type of creature to men. And I think when you're put in that situation and you're given that level of power and privilege, you naturally will begin participating in it without even being totally aware that you're participating in it. It's the water we're swimming in.
Can you elaborate on that, Chavisa? I'm sure there's some guys out there who think, I don't view women that way at all, and I would never do something like that to a woman. When you say that that's the framework that we're brought up with, can you give me an example of that? That may be something that men aren't even conscious of that we're receiving.
Well, sure. I remember in the 4th grade, the girls and boys were separated, and the girls were taught about our menstrual cycle, having our periods, and the boys, we found out were taught about sexual arousal and desire in separate rooms and separate classes for the day. And I realize now, looking back on it, that when boys were going through puberty, they were taught, your body is going to change, you're going to start having these sexual desires. And girls were taught, you can get pregnant now, you have to control your body. And it was nothing about our sexual desire ever said to us when we were young. And I'm 37 years old, so this was in the mid-90s, when I was the early 90s when I was in grade school. And I think that has a profound impact on men and women when women are told that you are just an object of sexual desire. Your sexual desire is not equal to men, is not as intense as men's. And from the time they're very young, boys are told there's nothing to be ashamed of with your sexual desire. But girls are made to feel very ashamed of their sexual desire. And I think this also translates into women being afraid to come forward about rape. Because if they're afraid to say yes, they're also afraid to tell people that when they said no, someone didn't listen, because it could mean that they were complicit in that. And if women are ashamed of having had sex or having sexual desire, or having flirted, and that could be implied, then they're ashamed to come forward.
Talk to me, Chavisa, about how this list came about. As I understand it, you started kind of documenting the incidents that you had been through, not with a book in mind, but just as a process that you had hoped would be kind of, I don't know if therapeutic is the right word.
I think, now looking back on it, I think it is a mindfulness technique to sort of just write down what happened and make lists. When I was 27 years old, I was living in Brooklyn, and it was a very hot summer, and you dress a little more scantily when it's hot, and I was getting sexually harassed in my late 20s to the point that it was having an impact on my mental health. It was mostly from street harassment, and literally when I would walk out of my apartment down the street to the subway, I would get harassed at least 2 times in that 15-minute walk. Sometimes I would be groped, or men would grab my arm, I had a couple men grab my breasts, and I was just sort of spinning out, and my friends saw me that I was talking about it all the time. I seemed very agitated and anxious. And some of my friends thought maybe I was overreacting, and some of them told me I had to find a way to deal with this. So I started just writing down at the end of the day any incidents of sexual harassment that had occurred that day. And I thought in a few weeks I'll be able to look back at it and see if it really is as constant as I'm feeling it is. And the last log that I did, a man masturbated at me, kind of on me in the park, and I had to run away. Then another man, after I ran away and went to a different part of the park with my date, another man tried to grab me. And then I went home, and on my way home, a man blocked my path to my apartment and asked me if I was looking to get pregnant tonight. And I wrote that down at the end of the day, and the next day I looked at it and I just stopped. I stopped taking a log, and I thought to myself, I'm not overreacting. I'm reacting appropriately to the circumstances.
Before I bring E. Jean back into the conversation, Chavisa, I'd like to get your reaction to a tweet from Doc, who wrote, "Most rapists don't recognize themselves as such. I've been assaulted in various types of situations. The latest attempted to assault me in my own house. There have been more than 5 incidents in my life." Chavisa, you explained that there are some men in your book who have done completely inappropriate things, but they don't see themselves as monsters, as complicit.
Right, and I was actually just speaking about this outside with a woman I know. I think there's a part in my book where a man tries to kiss me a couple of times, and I say no, and he tries to kiss me again. And I write in the book, if this is all that had happened, this wouldn't be going in the book. But after the second time I said no, he pushed me down, grabbed my ankle, and attempted to force himself on me. And I don't know why exactly, but in so many conversations I have with men, they talk about it like flirtation or coming on to someone. is the thing that we are saying you can't do. That is not true. We are saying there is a line, and to most women, I think it's very clear where consent is breached. And for some reason, and I think it has to do with what I spoke about before, about men feeling like they have sexual desire and women are only the objects of sexual desire without their own sexual desire. Men don't see that line as clearly because they haven't been taught to see it.
And Chavisa, before I bring Eugene back in, you describe yourself as a queer woman. How has that affected your experiences with sexism and sexual harassment, and how people react to your account of what happens to you?
Well, interestingly, I was asked in an interview a few days ago if I had a more negative reaction because I'm primarily, well, I only date women, to sexual harassment and assault. And I thought, well, what is the implication here that if I were more physically attracted to men, I would like being discriminated against, assaulted, or raped? That's pretty ridiculous. I think what it has done, though, is I notice when I'm out with my male friends, men do not sexually harass me, especially on the street, as often. But because when I'm out, I'm most often with a female partner, we are more likely to get sexually harassed together. So I don't have that barrier in place by having a male partner. So I think it has possibly caused more sexual harassment when they don't recognize us as gay. And when they do, it causes a combination of homophobic and sexist harassment to occur.
Eugene Carroll, let me bring you back in. You, like Chavisa, used a list to describe your experiences. I wonder how you reflect on just the fact that it's a list. If there was a point at which you thought, holy crap, I have like pages and pages of people who did this to me. Like, how do you wrap your brain around that?
No, I only had one page. It was all fit on one page. I could name them right down.
Well, but of the stories, that's multiple pages of stories.
That was pages and pages.
Right.
But it slowly dawned on me. I was on a road trip going to towns named after women, getting out of the car and asking women, what do we need men for? So I am hearing these stories from women who are telling me why they don't need men. And it can't help, Joshua, but remind me of all the little assholes in my own life. So the list happened during this road trip. And when I got home, I made it official on one page. And Joshua, I was astounded because it started at 3 with a babysitter and just went on from there. And the memories came back. And it was, by the way, I'm sitting across from Chavisa. Mm-hmm. She has a femhawk, a mohawk. It's about 4 feet high. It's red. And putting this microphone on her ears has dented her femhawk.
You know what?
I am very concerned about this, Joshua.
As a man with a mohawk, I want to formally apologize.
Wait a minute. You have a mohawk too?
Well, you can't see it on the radio. We'll continue in just a minute with Eugene Carroll and Chavisa Woods. We also want to add another voice to our conversation from the organization Time's Up, and we want to share more of your stories. Before we pause, here's one more that landed in our inbox.
I was sexually assaulted by my doctor. I'm a senior citizen. Nobody would believe me. This has been a nightmare. I have PTSD. I'm scared to death every time I go to a doctor. He put in my medical records that I was coming on to him. This record follows me everywhere. They won't remove it. How unethical, how horrible and immoral this is to do this to me. I'm just sick.
It's a good, I can't imagine not being sick over this. We'll talk about the efforts to have more accountability when things like this happen in just a moment. Stay close.
The next fresh air. Which party is in power in the next decade in Congress and state houses could be determined by last month's Supreme Court decisions on gerrymandering and the census citizenship question, and by what the Trump administration does next about the census. We'll talk about why with Ari Berman, who covers voting rights for Mother Jones. Join us. Today at 4 p.m. East, 1 West on NPR Now.
MLB Network Radio takes you onto the field for All-Star Week in Cleveland, Ohio.
Altuve drills it deep to left.
This afternoon at 5 Eastern, Jim Duquette, Jim Bowden, and Casey Stern are on the field talking to baseball's best players prior to the 90th All-Star Game.
Quick couple of minutes to shout Mike Trout.
MLB Network Radio and the All-Stars. Sirius 209, XM 89, and listen when you get out of your car on your phone with the Sirius XM app.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Home Advisor, committed to helping homeowners find the right pro for their home projects. Homeowners can get matched to local pros, read reviews, and check project cost guides at homeadvisor.com. From Noom, offering a personalized weight loss program that uses psychology, small goals, and technology designed to help people change habits and keep the weight off for good at Noom, Noom.com. And from the listeners who support this NPR station.
You know, today we're dealing with some really heavy stuff, but tomorrow we'll focus on a much more positive interaction that many women can relate to: friendships, especially with other women. The way we view female friendships is evolving in pop culture and in real life, and we're thinking more deeply about the life cycle of these bonds, especially when girlfriends find their lives or careers diverging. We'd love to know about your best girlfriend. How did you meet, and what makes you so close? Leave us a voicemail, 855-236-1A1A. Now, perhaps you and your best female friend aren't as close as you used to be. What happened? And have you been able to close the divide? Tell us your story, and feel free to call us together if you'd like. Both of you on the line can leave us a voicemail at 855-236-1A1A, or you can send us a radio-quality audio file through our app, 1A Vox Pop. We'll share some of your stories tomorrow on 1A. Back now to our conversation with E. Jean Carroll and Chavisa Woods. Before we continue, let me repeat that number to the National Sexual Assault Hotline. Here it is one more time, 800-656-4673. We've also included some other links that you might find helpful. You'll find them online at the1a.org. That's the word the number one, the letter A.org. Let's add one more voice to our conversation. Joining us now is Fatima Goss Graves. She's the president and CEO of the National Women's Law Center and co-founder of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. Fatima, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us what the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is.
So we launched January 1st, 2018, and we are a place where people can come to get attorney information, representation, and also assistance from public relations firms to tell their stories. Since we launched, we've heard from about 5,000 people who come from 60 different sectors around the country, all have similar stories of experiencing harassment or violence at work or related retaliation and need support.
It sounds like, from the way that Time's Up was described early on, that this is kind of to assist women who have been through something like this but need help in that kind of rubber meeting road way, with actually doing something about what was done to them.
There's no question. After Me Too went viral, survivors were telling their stories, some digitally online and others just with family and with friends. And some of them wanted to take a next step. And what they're able to do by calling Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is get a free screening with an attorney, find out if they have a case. And sometimes people have gone forward with their cases. We have now also been able to fund and support over 100 cases. And it is one of those things because when we look at who is able to often bring cases, oftentimes low-wage workers have real difficulty finding someone to stand up for them. But now we're able to hear from restaurant workers and farm workers, domestic workers, and make sure that they have someone who's fighting for them too.
We got a lot of comments, Fatima, from people who dealt with retaliation or shame or kind of being ostracized after they spoke out about what happened to them. We got a voicemail from a woman who said she worked in one of Donald Trump's country clubs and was fired after she reported being harassed. Here is what Elle left in our inbox.
My name is Elle, and I worked in Virginia for one of the Trump National Country Clubs. They had installed 360-degree cameras. The manager viewed us from home on camera, and even on his day off, and he would call and make lewd comments about what we were bending over to do, and that he saw us leaving a room, what were we up to, and I reported it to HR in New York, and soon after I was let go. The girl who replaced me had the same complaints, and she managed to get that manager fired. But I ended up having to sell my home over it because they fired me at the beginning of January.
Wow. Elle, thank you very much for sharing that story. And she, unfortunately, is not alone. According to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, sexual harassment complaints rose almost 14% last year. 3/4 of those complaints included charges of retaliation. Fatima, how much of speaking out just involves dealing with retaliation?
I have to tell you, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's numbers track the numbers we see at Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. So many of the people we hear from talk about how they tried to go to HR, they tried to use their formal systems, and when they did, sometimes they were fired. But retaliation takes many forms. Sometimes it means that you didn't get that promotion. Sometimes it means that you have to work that worst shift or you don't get enough hours. And so one of the things that we have learned is that it is not enough to deal with squarely the problem of harassment. We have to deal with retaliation. We really have to deal with the culture that allowed it to thrive in the first place.
Isn't retaliation illegal, though? Is there any law preventing that?
It is illegal, right? It is illegal, but what they are counting on is that you're not going to do anything about it. They're counting on the fact that when they retaliate against you, they send a signal not just to you, but to every other person in that workplace who dare speak up. And that is what has been so powerful about Me Too. The opportunity for people to fight back, the opportunity for people to change that calculus. It is now worse for employers to do nothing or worse for employers to retaliate against that brave person who came forward and tried to make a difference.
So what do you do, Fatima, for women who have the least power in our society to defend themselves when losing their job, or, say they're undocumented workers, so deportation is a potential threat, when losing their job could basically shatter everything? How do you give them the strength to go on?
I will tell you, not everyone decides to come forward. But one of the things that we know is that there is power in the collective. That's why we saw Me Too go viral, right? People found each other. So sometimes people aren't ready to go forward by themselves, but when they're paired up with other people, when they find the way to come forward as a group, that changes the calculus. We also know that our laws are failing many workers. They're failing them because they're not always covered. Too many workers are in workplaces that are small or in workplaces where they are technically considered independent contractors, so therefore not covered by our federal civil rights laws. So we have to change that too.
And just to be clear, Fatima, why does working in a small workplace make a difference?
Well, our federal laws start with employers who are 15 or more. So if you're working in a small restaurant or a small store, or if you're a domestic worker working in a home, in almost every state in this country, you have no federal protections. Those are the types of changes that we need to make.
We're speaking to Fatima Goss-Graves, the president and CEO of the National Women's Law Center and co-founder of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. Also, Chavisa Woods, author of 100 Times, a memoir of sexism, and E. Jean Carroll, author of What Do We Need Men For? A Modest Proposal. Fatima, you mentioned the Me Too movement. How have you watched this movement evolve just since the Harvey Weinstein story broke?
The Me Too movement has exploded, and one of the things that I wanted to correct is it has not been and has never been just about high-profile people. It is true that the media was very enamored with high-profile people. But what has been beautiful about the vision of Me Too that Tarana Burke outlined is that it allowed people to be connected, whether they are working under the bright lights of Hollywood or in the shadows of janitorial work. And that work has continued. It also has allowed people to tell stories outside of work, the harassment and violence that students experience, the harassment and violence people experience when they're trying to get medical care, when they're trying to get housing. So what Me Too movement is really doing right now, it is changing our cultural understanding of what is and is not okay behavior. And that cultural shift will be very difficult to undo.
Chavisa Woods, I understand that you are a supporter of Me Too, but you've noted that there are gaps in the movement that you hope your book would help fill. What kinds of gaps are you talking about?
Well, I suppose that sexual harassment and sexual violence are only one part of a much larger systemic problem. There are disparities that just have no equivalent in the lives of men. Male violence is actually a major health risk and a factor in mortality rates for women. And there's no such thing as like a reversal of that. Women are not murdering men because of their gender and because of this sexist disparity at rates anywhere comparable to the rate that women are actually murdered by men and often by their male partners when they're trying to leave the relationship. There are disparities in the amount of money that we're paid. There are disparities just in the way that we're treated by our families in every sphere of society. So it's not just about sexual violence. It's also about discrimination, unconscious bias, and violence.
E. Jean, I'd love to get your sense of the changing way that we're talking about sexual assault, rape, sexual harassment. We heard from several listeners about what happened to them. I'd love to get your reaction to another mashup. Here is what 3 more listeners left in our inbox.
My name is Melanie, and I'm calling from Michigan. I was sexually assaulted 17 years ago by the uncle of one of my friends. What's unfortunate is how vulnerable I still feel sometimes, even all these years later. The pain I feel is just as strong as it was all those years ago.
Hello, my name is Maureen. I was raped when I was 11, and it was at that time that I realized the limitations of being female. No matter how much I fought, it wasn't possible for the inevitable to happen. That definitely was a huge life lesson at such a young age.
Hi, this is Diana from Michigan. When I was a junior in high school, I attended a party where I was date raped, and it was videotaped. It was then distributed throughout my high school and at parties for weeks after. My parents went to the police, and the police decided that because I was drinking alcohol, I was to blame for my rape and assault. It took me 10 years, several mental health facilities, an attempt on my own life in order to cope with it.
I was raped by my boyfriend in my mid-20s, someone I loved, and I didn't report it. In fact, I tried to just forget about it. And I also believe that, maybe it didn't happen. It wasn't rape. Couldn't have happened to me.
And thank you, Melanie and Maureen and Diana, for sharing your stories with us. E. Jean, that last caller mentioned that she thought maybe what happened to her didn't happen. It wasn't rape. You have said that you don't think of what happened to you as rape, though legally it may be considered so. What's your sense of the kind of changing way that we're describing these same kinds of incidents?
Well, every woman gets to choose her own word. Every woman, my word is fight. Other women, they like the word harassment or rape. I just want to say